Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the first H Advisors Sustain webinar. Today, we are going to be talking about ESG regulations and what the future is. I know there's a lot coming up across the world in this area, and a lot of people have asked us about this. So we thought it'd be great to host a webinar. Just before we get going, I just want to talk about a little bit of housekeeping. There will be a Q&A session at the end. We have left time for that. Please use the question box on your screen to ask a question. We'll be collating that and we will be asking it at the end. If we could just use that, it would make our lives a lot easier than people trying to come on screen and ask a question, and we'll be able to get through many more. So if I could go to today's agenda quickly. So my name's Ryan Kisiel. I look after Sustain based out of London, but we have clients across the world globally. I'll be giving you a quick introduction. My colleague Sebastien, based in Paris, will be talking us through the latest regulations, mainly focusing on CSRD. And then we are very, very, very lucky to have Sylvain from EcoVadis today. He is the Chief Rating Officer, and he will be talking us through the latest regulations, trends, and reporting frameworks more generally. And then finally, as discussed, we will be going into a Q&A. So a little bit about H Advisors. A lot of people know us. We rebranded last year. We are the strategic advisory firms network out of Havas. And as you can see, we have a presence in most major cities, if not all, in the world. And we have a network called Sustain. And that network will give you local expertise with a global network in all things ESG. So some of the things we offer on the next slide is obviously we do non-financial ESG and sustainability reporting, general ESG advice, investor relations, especially with an ESG angle, but we also provide things like materiality assessments, especially double materiality assessments. And across our network, we've carried out a lot of these for global organizations. We also help people with their websites and their social media comms, and also at the media relations and thought leadership side. So we really can help all organizations with our ESG comms. And then if we go on to the next slide, please. And as you can see from our approach, how we work with organizations, we can really help organizations who are first starting an ESG strategy, have no idea, know that they've got to do this, work with their stakeholders, build them up into full-scale reporting, but also with people with mature offerings in honing in their media relations, sometimes even simplifying your ESG comms where it's got too much and the detail has got lost in huge volumes, which is very easy to do, and also putting leaders in that thought leadership space. So without further ado, I know we want to leave lots of time for the Q&A. I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Sebastien.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you all. I'm very pleased to host this first H Advisors Sustain webinar with Ryan, and very pleased to have Sylvain as a guest speaker. I will go briefly about an overview about the EU regulation and tackling the CSRD, which is the hottest topic. I don't know if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. The CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that came into force last January 5. So basically, EU countries have 2 years for the transposition, and it will come and it will concern companies as of 2025 for their reporting on 2024. The main consequence is that equities companies become officially the armed wing of the EU regulation to achieve the EU sustainable ambitions. A bit of history, where does that all come from? If we can, next, please. It all started with the COP21 and the Paris Agreement, where there was an official call for more transparency in finance, in financial flows and financing sustainable projects, with Article 2C that is quoted here. Beyond this call of transparency and following this call for transparency, Next, please. The EU Green Deal in 2020. If we can go on to the next slide, please. Basically sets a more demanding regulation with a wider scope, and it consists in reviewing all EU rules and directives in light of sustainability. So several rules and guidelines will be implemented. Next. You all know, you've all heard of the different goals of these EU Green Deals. The European Union wants to be the first climate neutral continent by 2050. It aims at cutting down its greenhouse gas emission by 2030 by at least 55% compared to 1990, and it aims at planting 3 billion additional trees. These are the main core objectives. And what's interesting, if you see below, is that all sectors of the economy are concerned. It comes to water, air, biodiversity, to buildings, to food and agriculture, to transport, to energy. So basically, all companies will be concerned, and no one will be left behind when it comes to asking companies to enhance sustainable efforts. Next. One of the examples briefly to that illustrate that is the Fit for 55 package that has been launched in 2021. And here you definitely see that all companies, all sectors will make and contribute to the effort to reduce the carbon footprint of the European Union. Now, a quick focus on the CSRD. Next. Is it aims at exiting greenwashing as of 2040. It tackles non-financial reporting. It actually replaces the non-financial reporting directives. It has three major changes on three big directives. What's very important is that it has a wide scope of application with more than 50,000 equities now to be concerned. A sustainability report becomes mandatory with information on the business model, its impact on sustainability, and we tackle the double materiality approach now. And delegated acts will be updated every 3 years. So it's an ongoing process. It's a living regulation, and it's not just because it's been published that we know what's gonna come next. If we can move on to the next slide, who's concerned? That's another very important point. Basically, all EU companies with at least 2 out of 3 criteria, publicly listed equities, but also international and non-EU companies are concerned by this directive and this canvas when it comes to reporting, as long as they have some activities within European Union. Next. It's really important to note that the CSRD creates a common canvas of information and a common canvas to all companies, whether they're European or international, to communicate and disclose their sustainable information. You have required information on double materiality, on ESG goals, progress of achievement, a digital tagging that will have to be implemented, not to be in line with the EU taxonomy, a third-party verification, European standards that are to be published and updated regularly. So it's really going to be harder and harder to emerge in terms of communication and in terms of achievement when it comes to ESG for companies. Next, please. So companies are finally on the front line. They are, as I said, the armed wing of the EU regulation to achieve European sustainable goals. It will be more and more difficult for companies to emerge among their competitors, and it becomes more and more essential for companies with an activity within the European Union to have an efficient ESG strategy, a strategy that has to be fully implemented, that has to involve its stakeholder, and that will have to achieve results. I would say you have 2 big principles with this new regulation. One is transparency, the other is accountability. Companies will have to prove their achievements and their results. All of that with a common canvas of communication. So it would be harder to emerge. And this is the reason why we've come up with this H Advisors Sustain new offer. But there is more to come. If we can move on to the next slide. It's not just about this latest hot topic with the CSRD. And this is why we have Sylvain Guyoton from EcoVadis as a guest speaker, who will go deeper into the regulation and will explain what is more to come, notably in terms of international legislation competition within EU, US, and China. Thank you, Sylvain. I'll give you the mic. Thank you all.
Sebastien, thank you, Ryan. I'm very happy to be with you this morning. Thanks again for the advisors team for inviting me to this webinar, whose topic is more than ever on top of the agenda. So let me say a word about EcoVadis first. If you can go to the next slide. EcoVadis is a global collaborative platform whose purpose is to help all companies become more sustainable. We do so by evaluating their sustainability performance against best practices and in comparison with their peers as well, which come under the form of sustainability ratings. And we provide them with tools to support their improvement journey and to engage with their corporate clients and their investors. Today, we work with 1,000 procurement organizations and about 30 major investment funds, our so-called requesting clients, who are asking EcoVadis to engage their suppliers or their portfolio companies towards being rated on their sustainability performance and starting their improvement journey. So far, we have rated more than 100,000 businesses in more than 175 countries in 200 industry sectors. We rate companies wherever they are in their sustainability journey, whatever their size and their industry sector. We're aiming at improving all companies to become more sustainable, not just the happy few. So for these reasons, we have become in 2022 an official purpose-led organization, and we have a fantastic team of about 1,500 employees in more than 15 countries around the world. And if you want to know more about us, you're welcome to read our impact report available online. So if you can go to the next slide, what I want to say first is that the subject of ESG and regulation is not new. Sustainability or ESG topics have always been linked to some form of regulations. In environment, there are already lots of regulations. With regard to social and human rights issues, there are also lots of legal requirements. But up to, let's say, 5 years ago, sustainability and ESG practices were understood as being everything the company was doing above those legal requirements. Sustainability practices were understood as being voluntary practices aimed at improving the business, mitigating impact on stakeholders, and avoiding getting into legal issues. On this part, precisely, avoiding getting into legal issues. For instance, there has always been laws against corruption, but in the past, laws did not ask you to implement code of ethics in your organization. They were simply asking you to respect the law, and the how-to was left to your own decision. Same for mitigating impact on stakeholders. It was recognized as a best practice to be transparent and report publicly on your sustainable KPI, but it was not a legal requirement in most jurisdictions and for most companies. As you know, today, this is changing. The regulatory bar is rising, making, for instance, ESG reporting mandatory for more and more companies, or asking companies to implement due diligence systems to avoid getting into human rights issues. In other words, there is a huge regulatory wave absorbing sustainability practices, which were for a long time voluntary, and some people are even calling it a tsunami of regulation. So it's important also to note that the regulatory bar rising is not even across countries. There are some regions moving faster than others. Sebastien was talking about CSRD in Europe. That's an example of things going fast forward. So some regions are moving faster than others, and in addition, all those regulations, although they concern ESG topics, are not always moving in the same direction. So not at the same speed, not exactly at the same direction. But before I zoom into this phenomenon, it is important to understand why this new wave of regulation is happening, because it will help you understand how to approach it. So in the next slide, what I'd like to explain is that, as you have probably noticed, ESG has become mainstream in the past 5 years, if we judge by the number of sustainability reports that are issued by large corporations or by the number of times the subject is put on the table in earning calls, not to mention the numerous surveys published year after year showing that ESG is on the top of the agenda for CEOs and board members. But if we look at the next slide, we see that the most pressing issues, for instance, climate change and biodiversity loss, we see that the situation is worsening year after year, and we are in fact in a pretty dire situation. The latest report from the IPCC shows that we are going towards a temperature rise well above 2 degrees Celsius, with consequences for millions of people that will be devastating. And the impact on biodiversity is already happening, not only because of climate change, but also because of human expansion and economic activities throughout the globe. The number of living species has dropped by 69% since 1970, according to WWF. So why one of the reasons, in the next slide, ESG practices are not producing positive effect is the fact that in one hand, most social and environmental impact are happening upstream in your global supply chain. And that on the other hand, the bulk of sustainability practices are still undertaken by large publicly listed companies, which represent the tip of the iceberg, and therefore the submerged part of the iceberg, which is made of millions of small and medium-sized businesses, is still pretty immature or inactive on the subject. So yet, this is where I was just saying we find the worst environmental degradation, deforestation, or water pollution, and also the worst human rights problems. Remember the Rana Plaza tragedy in Bangladesh in 2013 with more than 1,000 victims in a building in Dhaka that collapsed. So that's the reason why, as an example, that's the reason why corporate leaders such as Unilever or Nestle have set bold targets when it comes to their supply chain. And in addition to that, in the next slide, let's not forget as well that for 2 steps forward, there is often 1 step backward. And serious greenwashing is still around. And each time there is a greenwashing scandal, civil society, but also ESG practitioners lose a bit of trust in ESG practices. So the main reason that I wanted to explain is basically the consequence of that in the next slide is that legislators have decided to step in. Too long, business corporations have said, don't worry, we will become more sustainable and more responsible. We don't need regulations. But in light of what I've just described now, some legislators in Europe, but not only, some legislators have started to say about 5-7 years ago, enough is enough. And a wave of legislative initiatives aimed at enforcing ESG reporting, due diligence in supply chains, and climate change actions have started to unfold, with the most ambitious legislative program probably being the European Green Deal, launched by the European Commission in 2020. And you see here a photo of the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, talking at the Parliament. So what's happening is that ESG regulations are now catching up on making the fundamentals of ESG practices mandatory. So in other words, the regulatory bar is rising, but it should not be an excuse for business to do the minimum. In other words, merely respecting legal requirements. Sustainability, as a reminder, is not about mitigating negative impact on the company holders. Risk management, in other words, the so-called sustainability 1.0, sustainability practices should aim at zero negative impact or even positive impact, sustainability 3.0. And why not being regenerative? Because as we have seen, there is a lot to restore already. So legislations are englobing the fundamentals of ESG, but business should continue climbing the maturity curve with the purpose of generating positive impact towards planet and society. We find ESG regulations for all types of economic actors in all main regions of the world, as we can see in the next slide. There are ESG regulations aimed at investors and issuers in Europe, North America, and Asia. They deal with corporate reporting, with climate change, and also with taxonomies. Green taxonomies are appearing everywhere. They are designed to define for once and for all what is a green activity and therefore what is a green investment. This is to respond to greenwashing claims in the finance industry. And of course, green taxonomies are open to intense debate, which activity should be included or not in those taxonomies. But in the end, there will be a significant improvement to the current unregulated green investment market. So here, as you can see, some examples of those regulations I've just mentioned. And it's not only in Europe, in the US, it's also, Canada, Chile, Brazil, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Singapore. So it's really a global phenomenon. Next slide, you also have new ESG regulations also looking at targeting environmental and social issues in supply chains. A wave of supply chain due diligence and traceability regulations is spreading across the globe. Those regulations are asking large corporations, companies who have typically thousands and thousands of suppliers around the globe to look at the social and environmental risk within their supplier portfolio. They are asking to engage their suppliers to improve. They are asking for mechanisms to trace the flow of rare or precious commodities, like wood, for instance. Most supply chain due diligence systems rely on the same framework, which is based around risk mapping, evaluation, remediation, and capacity building. So if we step back for a minute in the next slide, we can see three major types of ESG regulations. The ones related to supply chains, due diligence or traceability, mostly aimed at procurement and purchasing organizations of large corporations. The ones aimed at addressing climate change issues towards investors and corporate issuers, and the general ESG reporting requirements and transparency requirements aimed at almost all businesses, not only the large corporations, and the main example being CSRD, Sebastien about now. So let's look at a minute for three important examples. So for you to get more concrete visualization in the next slide. First of all, we have the corporate sustainability due diligence, a European directive aimed at imposing in the 27 EU countries a law for corporations to implement supply chain due diligence. This directive is being discussed at the European Parliament and at the European Commission as we speak. It will probably be enacted this year and should be transposed into national laws within 18 months following the enacting of the directive. So it will be effective around 2025. For those who are interested, Didier Reinders, the European Commissioner in charge of this directive, will be speaking at EcoVadis annual conference on March 13 and 14 in Paris. So I encourage you to join us in Paris to listen to him. The second one, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the so-called carbon tax at the frontier of the European Union, will be a carbon tariff on carbon-intensive products such as cement imported in the European Union. It should be effective in 2026, and it will concern companies exporting goods to Europe, so companies typically in the US or in Asia, for instance. And the third example is the green taxonomy developed by Singapore under the Monetary Authority of Singapore, a taxonomy in the making aimed at regulating better green investment, and in a market context where green and sustainability linked loans have grown very rapidly in the past few years, and maybe a bit too rapidly. So in conclusion, and before opening up the floor to questions, in conclusion, in the next slide, this wave of new ESG regulations, which I call the return of the visible hand, is here to stay. There's no point of return. It will take time to completely unfold in all regions and all sectors, and therefore you should be prepared for at least 10 years of rollout. Complexities, let's be honest, due to those new regulations will emerge way before things will get simpler. Those regulations will put a lot of emphasis on data and transparency, data that companies don't necessarily have in the first place. So on this point, ESG data business should be moving faster to be able to, to respond ultimately to these transparency requirements. And complexities will be accentuated by the emergence of three clear regulatory blocks, namely the US, Europe, and China, with each block approaching those ESG regulations with a slightly different angle. So I think in the end, one should not forget that it's always less costly to anticipate than to react to those new legal requirements. And also at the positive side, and in my opinion, point, those regulations will be an additional incentive and opportunity for companies to climb the maturity curve, and in the end to create more value for their business and also for planet and society. Thank you, and now I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Sylvain. We've had a few questions come in. If anyone has any questions, please use the question box on your screen. We'll try and get through as many as possible. I am going to merge two questions that have come in because they're very similar. The first one is, are all these regulations comparable? And is Europe taking the lead? And the final point is this: if you had to pick one regulation to follow, is it fair if you followed something like CSRD or what Europe's doing? Will you be covered globally?
Yeah, those regulations are comparable. They have similarities, and Sebastien was talking about it very well. I think they are asking for more transparency on what you're doing. One of the aims is to address greenwashing claims, and the aim is accountability. So that's the common trait. It's basically civil society. Society wants to know what is happening in businesses and also in their supply chain. And I think you were asking if you had to pick one. I'm not sure you need to. When it comes to legal requirements, I wouldn't say you have to choose your battle. I think if it's legal requirements, you have to do it no matter what. So I think the first thing you should be doing is kind of do a impact analysis of which regulation will be you subject to on one hand, because it's not entirely clear at this stage when we look at all those regulations in the making, what will be the exact scope. So it's important that you anticipate and then you understand better which ones will be, you know, asked and mandatory to your business. The second thing, in parallel, as I was saying, you should make sure that your sustainability, internal sustainability rating is up, meaning making sure you will be able to provide the data in environment, in social, in supply chain that will, you know, be required anyway. So I think there are really two things to be doing in parallel is, you know, understanding very well which kind of regulation you will be subject to. And again, I repeat, this is not necessarily 100% clear because those regulations are still in the making for some of them. And then two, making sure you are in control of the data that you will be producing for those requirements.
Great. Thank you. We have another question that's come in, which is how important is the GRI standard now, and how important will it be in 5 years, and why?
Very good question. So the GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, was kind of the ESG reporting standards for the past 15, 20 years in a world where ESG reporting was more or less voluntary. Now, I think it will be less important in the future because it will be basically kind of replaced by the major ESG reporting requirements. So in Europe, CSRD, which will be inspired quite importantly by GRI, and I think as those regulations will unfold and spread, I think GRI will become less important. So, I mean, I cannot predict the future, but I see basically GRI is going to be kind of diluted or absorbed by EFRAG. So EFRAG is the organization in charge of defining the reporting standards that will be the foundation of CSRD. Sorry for all those acronyms. And I think EFRAG has, you know, taken in the work that they're doing, that they have taken GRI as a basis point. So I think one scenario is that GRI will be disappearing and will be kind of encapsulated in ESG reporting regulations in Europe and other parts of the world as well.
Thank you. We've got some ratings questions now. No doubt you expected these top tips. The first one is, I've got two ratings questions. The first one is, can you give your top tips for companies who are going under the ratings process? What do you look for? What would you advise companies to do?
Okay, interesting question. No, so first of all, I think it's a good question because indeed ESG ratings are becoming more important. To be honest, they are under criticism because they are not always consistent with one another. But I think it's a way of looking at a half empty glass, not a half full glass. I think it's positive. It's here to decision makers compare companies one another's. You know, if you're an investor, if you're a buyer, if you're a consumer, it's very difficult to compare corporations, businesses, because they don't really necessarily report the same thing, or if they report the same thing, it's not necessarily the same units of measure. So it's complex, and even for one company to compare the performance of the company from one year to another, it's complicated, because from one year to another, sometimes they change the way they report on their key performance indicators. So basically, between the decision makers, the buyers, the consumers, and the companies, in a major kind of group, the ratings that are here to, provide an independent third-party opinion, and so that's why we are here, is to manage this complexity and to provide an opinion to the decision makers so that they can act upon what we see. And my advice, if I can advise to companies being rated, I think it's all based on data and information. We need to know what you are doing in terms of targets, commitments, in terms of action to support your targets and commitments, in terms of result that you have achieved, in terms of progress against your targets. So if you have those information on all the topics that are material to your business in a structured way, it makes things easier for us, and I think the rating will go better. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's all about transparency and being able to provide data in a structured way on those topics that are material to your business.
Great, thank you very much. I've just got a quick one follow up to that on ratings. Is you talked about benchmarking companies. Is there a template which could be filled out to have a first assessment, or does it depend on the business sector?
Just I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you repeat?
I think it's you talked about how you benchmark companies. Is there any guidance or a template of what companies need to follow before they submit their first assessment, or does it depend on the business and the sector? I guess it's, do you have any tools available to guide you through the process?
Yeah, okay, no, very good question. So yeah, first of all, all businesses are unique. But I think if we want to be able to compare them, we need to put them into one framework. So indeed, at EcoVadis, for instance, we have produced what we call materiality analysis. So we have identified what are the important topics for 200 sectors, what are the important ESG topics for 200 industry sectors. And therefore, when you belong to one specific industry sector, we will be looking at your ESG performance through this lens and framework, this specific materiality analysis. So basically, concretely, what it means that when you start the rating, you can have access to the questionnaire that will be asked to you in terms of what you're doing, and this questionnaire follows this framework, and you have a list of the criteria that have been activated, so you know on which topic you will be asked to respond. So indeed, yes, we have a lot of tools up front to explain to you what we need, how it works, what kind of documents we're looking for. We want to make sure the process is as enjoyable as possible. And remember, it's not only to please your stakeholders, it's also this evaluation from a third party is also here to help you identify where you can improve and how you can guide your next steps.
Great, thank you. We have two more quick questions. The first one is, while writing your ESG report, do we write according to the CSRD principles now? And who will we present these reports to for an audit?
Maybe Sebastien, you want to take this one, or should I answer? Since you were talking about CSRD.
You can go if you want. It's,
okay.
I mean, my recommendation would be to follow CSRD as soon as possible, so that you have 1 year to make the correction. But I let you.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think if you're in Europe, definitively yes, you need to make sure your current framework will be, in line with what CSRD is will be. That's totally agree. And in the question, there was there's a mention of auditing. I think that's a very important point, because indeed in CSRD, there will be a mandatory requirement for those published data to be audited I never know the limited assurance or reasonable assurance. Maybe help me, Sebastien. Is it? I think it's reasonable assurance, which is not as strong as limited assurance. Still, data will have to be audited third party, and so I think that's also something you should take into account, because you need to find the right provider for that.
Great, thank you. And then finally, the last question is a bit of an open-ended one, but we'll try and have to answer it a bit concisely. Is many companies focus on the E of ESG, the environmental, when they're doing their reporting. However, there are many sectors where the impact on society is more important than environment, and they say, for instance, the media. Are there any companies you know in that sector that measure the public value of their impact to prove that they are doing better on their social obligations over time?
Wow, that's a tough question. So, no, I agree that because of climate change, because of being on the top of the agenda, the attention of companies and businesses and a lot of organizations is often on environmental matters. So one should not forget that, yes, in some industry sectors, the social implications with the workers, the employees, but also with society at large, is important. So indeed, media organizations have a societal responsibility, and they should be in their ESG reporting. They should be explaining how they take that into account and how they address it definitively. Now, to give you names, I won't, because I try to keep as neutral as possible. But if you are interested, you can always subscribe to EcoVadis rating platform, and I'm sure you will find very interesting media company who have great ratings. Sorry about the small publicity here.
That's a great plug, Sylvain, and I think that draws to conclusion our webinar. Thank you so much for everyone who's joined today. If you do have any more questions that you want asked, please email us. You can go through our channels. We're on LinkedIn if you don't have our exact emails. And thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much, Sylvain, for talking to us today, and Sebastien for explaining CSRD.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Sylvain. Thank you all.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.